This is an Irish independent podcast.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, it is a great pleasure that I can confirm that the host of the FIFA World Cup 2034 will be Saudi Arabia. Mabruk. Mabruk to our friends in Riyadh. Mabruk to everyone.
Well, it's official. The Men's World Cup is going to Saudi Arabia 2034. 10 years from now and 12 on from Qatar, the world's greatest sporting extravaganza is returning to the Middle East. And much like Qatar in 22, Saudi Arabia in 34 will have its fair share of controversies and problems. It's worth saying at the outset, the Saudis have won this World Cup in a very odd way. We'll come to that in a moment. As we now know, the Qatar bid was all secret meetings in hotels and suitcases full of cash and good old-fashioned bribery, and then huge surprise when the result was announced. There were audible gasps in the room when Qatar came out of the envelope.
FIFA World Cup is Qatar.
The Saudi Arabian ascent, meanwhile, has happened in plain sight. In fact, their hosting of this World Cup has felt somehow inevitable for several years. All obstacles have melted away. A central reason for that is FIFA President Gianni Infantino and the relationships he courts.
I just want to say you're led by a man named Gianni. I just know him as Gianni, and he's a winner. And he's the president, and I'm the president, and we've known each other a long time.
Born just 6 miles down the road from his predecessor Sepp Blatter, Infantino joined UEFA in the year 2000 as a 29-year-old. A qualified lawyer and fluent in 5 languages, he rose through the ranks at UEFA and became their Secretary-General in 2009. Come 2016, with Michel Platini mired in his own problems, Infantino was perfectly placed to win the FIFA presidential election of 2016. He presented himself as the great reformer, the man to clean up the Sepp Blatter mess. John Delaney said, "We are very pleased to support him. We've known Gianni a long time." Greg Dyke, the FA chairman, hailed him as a straightforward guy. David Gill called it a good day for football. Naturally, Infantino promised great days ahead.
I want to work with all of you together in order to restore and rebuild a new era in FIFA, a new era in FIFA where we can put again football in the center of the stage. And we will restore the image of FIFA and the respect of FIFA. And everyone in the world will applaud us and will applaud all of you.
To be fair to Infantino, his FIFA didn't award the 18 World Cup to Russia or the 22 World Cup to Qatar. That was the final parting gift from the Blatter regime. But in those 5 years leading up to Qatar, when he was in power, news filtered through of worker deaths and appalling working conditions at World Cup venues. The criticism of FIFA at the time and to this day is that it did not intervene nearly enough to address the situation. Interestingly, at the Qatar World Cup, rather than being cowed down by the scandal, Infantino went on the attack. He took special aim at the Western media.
So let's start with the migrant workers, if you allow me. We are told many, many lessons from some Europeans, from the Western world. I'm European. Actually, I am European. Not just I feel European. I think for what we Europeans have been doing in the last 3,000 years around the world, we should be apologizing for the next 3,000 years before starting to give moral lessons to people. This doesn't mean that we shouldn't point at what doesn't work. Here in Qatar as well. Of course, there are still things that don't work and that need to be addressed. But this moral lesson giving, one-sided, it's just hypocrisy.
He also, memorably in that same press conference, addressed the wider complaints levelled at Qatar.
Today I feel gay Today I feel disabled. Today I feel a migrant worker.
What he'd hoped might go down as Martin Luther King-esque was generally regarded as ill-judged at best. The 22 World Cup, though, was, of course, spectacular. It finished with Lionel Messi, King of the World, Gianni beaming in his white runners and suit, and Salt Bae dominating the on-pitch celebrations. But one thing was clear: Infantino was more than strong enough to weather any future media storms. By the way, we're all able to handle complexity. The point here is not to say Infantino is the bogeyman, terrible in every way, a floundering fool. The truth is, who knows? Time will tell. We are dealing in real-time history as we go here. For instance, in 2017, he criticised the USA's travel ban from Muslim countries. He said it would hurt their World Cup bid chances. In 2019, he publicly told Iran, "Our position is firm. Women have to be allowed into football stadiums in Iran. Now is the moment to change things." These were admirable stances. That said, he's had less to say about Saudi Arabian attitudes to women. As we've got to know him, what you also have to say about Infantino is that although he always talks about how humbled he is to serve the game and serve FIFA, there is a truly jaw-dropping level of ego at play. One recent example, this new Club World Cup, which starts next year. Naturally, it has a shiny new trophy. The engraving on this trophy reads as follows: "We are witness to a new age, the golden era of club football, the era of the FIFA Club World Cup, the pinnacle of all competitions. Inspired by Gianni Infantino." For good measure, his name is engraved a second time on the trophy. For extra good measure, his name is engraved a third time on the trophy in the guise of his signature. That's 3 Gianni Infantinos on one trophy. When it comes to Saudi Arabia and Infantino, the relationship began early. It was also a very public one. The 2018 World Cup in Russia was Infantino's first as president. The opening match of the tournament was Russia against Saudi Arabia, and Infantino sat between Vladimir Putin and Mohammed bin Salman, NBS. Whilst this was before the war in Ukraine and before the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, it was a striking image. A year later, in 2019, he was presented with the Russian Medal of Freedom in Moscow. Meanwhile, the NBS relationship grew. They attended other sporting events like Usyk Joshua in 2022 in Saudi Arabia. They are reportedly on direct messaging terms. 4 years after that famous World Cup match in Russia, there was the opening ceremony of the World Cup in Qatar. The television cameras quickly picked out Gianni Infantino and Mohammed bin Salman side by side in the royal box. They were deep in conversation and laughing. In 2018 in Russia, their proximity made reasonable sense. After all, Saudi Arabia were involved in the game. The 2022 Qatar version, though, felt a lot more like a statement. Suddenly, there was talk of a Saudi Arabian World Cup. But how would another Middle Eastern World Cup be magicked up so quickly? The process to get us to where we are today has been interesting. There have been some minor things. Take today. FIFA's own statutes say that only one World Cup can be awarded at a Congress. They're waving through 2 today. But hey, we'll live. There also won't be an in-person press conference afterwards. This whole thing is virtual. But then Infantino hasn't held a press conference in 18 months. Who's going to make him? He's not accountable to the press. But then we get on to the bigger stuff. And remember, we're talking about the World Cup here. This is not the craggy island over 70s. This is a big deal. If you think it feels a little early to go back to the Middle East on the rotation, it is. But here's where things get interesting. October last year, a decision was suddenly made to have the 2030 World Cup on 3 different continents. Uruguay, Paraguay, Argentina will get 3 games to mark the World Cup centenary. Spain and Portugal get their share, and also Morocco with theirs. So all of a sudden, ahead of schedule, South America, Europe and Africa will have had their World Cup in one fell swoop. This was convenient for Saudi Arabia. Things became more convenient. The very next day, after that 3 continents in one announcement, FIFA caught everybody on the hop. They opened the bidding process for the 2034 World Cup, and this had not been flagged as imminent. The tournament was 11 years away, but the deadline for putting together your bid, 25 days. Australia, on paper a very good candidate, had been interested. But in the end, they never submitted a bid. Their CEO, James Johnson, acknowledged they had been caught by surprise. The 25-day deadline was also tight. He said, "It is what it is." One country did seem ready. Within minutes of this process opening, Saudi Arabia publicly declared their interest. Their bid was ready. 25 days later, they were the only applicant. Of the entire world, the game's most popular sport, they were suddenly the only viable option. Just last month, the FIFA technical report on Saudi's bid was published. Despite being 11 stadiums and 185,000 hotel rooms short at present, the Saudis managed a record-breaking score on this technical assessment. FIFA published the report around midnight on Friday. It was hard not to think of that famous West Wing episode, Take Out the Trash Day. I'll let Josh Lyman explain.
What's Take Out the Trash Day?
Friday.
I mean, what is it?
Any stories we have to give the press that we're not wild about, we give them all in a lump on Friday.
Why do you do it on Friday?
Because no one reads the paper on Saturday.
So this is very different from the Qatar World Cup process. There was no shock in the room today. Miguel Delaney has literally written the book on this subject. Just this year, States of Play, How Sportswashing Took Over Football was published. I put it to Miguel, there has been something quite brazen about this whole Saudi FIFA World Cup 2034 process.
I mean, it's the image that keeps occurring to me is the shock on that day in 2010 when it was announced that Qatar got the World Cup. You could see it on Blatter's face. There's the story of him saying to Jerome Valcke, smile, and then all these stories about kind of FIFA people, the aftermath going, we're finished. There's none of that shock now. And also, I would say football didn't learn its lessons from that day in 2010. But those who want to emulate Qatar and rival Qatar, which is exactly what Saudi Arabia wants to do, very much did. So far from rather than the process that led to Qatar and led to so much criticism, so much stories about corruption, what Saudi Arabia has actually done has basically, through all discussions we've had in the past, like through purchase of Newcastle United, through the staging of sporting events, through the sponsoring of sporting events, it's very much normalized its presence in the game. It's fully integrated itself into the game and developed this burgeoning relationship with the president of FIFA, Gianni Infantino. And lo and behold, we've suddenly had this process where, in great contrast to Qatar and 2022, suddenly we've had this situation where the only possible candidate for 2034 is Saudi Arabia. Like, the brazenness, as you say, is absolutely striking.
What is your understanding of the relationship between these two, Infantino and MBS? We see them publicly at sporting events. Is this like, has this burgeoned into like a sincere, almost friendship?
Well, I suppose with all these things, I'm never sure you can call them friendships. And like, you know, people in football also talk about how Infantino thinks he's operating at the level of a state actor, which I suppose he pretty much is, given what FIFA is now. But ultimately, he's dealing with, you know, politicians and figures who are a lot cannier than he is. The backstory there is interesting. There's three figures that pretty much first came to power, which is pretty much the phrase, at the same time. They are Donald Trump, Gianni Infantino, and Mohammed bin Salman. And Infantino and Trump struck up a friendship at Davos, and it was Trump that very much encouraged a friendship between Infantino and Mohammed bin Salman. And there was an aligning of interest here because as part of coming to power as FIFA president, Infantino's promise was basically more money to the voter base, which is all of the member associations in the world. It's a patronage system that has been criticized in football structure before, where basically FIFA doles out money to its voters. It used to be through the old goal program, which is one of Sepp Blatter's most inspired political moves. And because of the lack of checks and balances and the way FIFA works, what these programs are really is a mechanism to returning those in power back into power.
Yeah.
Now, the flip side of that, though, is that came at a time when FIFA did not have as much money as it used to due to all the problems from the American state investigations. So Infantino needed money to fulfill election promises. At the same time, Saudi Arabia was undergoing this, we'd call it a sports washing process, as Mohammed bin Salman wanted to, I suppose, change the future of the state after a very staid and withdrawn history where it wasn't so visible on the international stage. And he was willing to spend an awful lot of the country's immense fossil fuel income to do that.
I want to play you a clip of Gianni Infantino. This is at Congress last year, and we haven't heard Infantino speak at a press conference in well over a year at this stage. So the context here is there had been talk of a Visit Saudi sponsorship deal with FIFA, which had fallen through, but nonetheless he was asked about how appropriate is it for deals with countries like Saudi Arabia. And at this stage, he'll mention Australia here, but that's because Australia was being talked about as a potential host, for instance. So, but the point of the clip is we get a direct answer here, in fairness to Infantino, about how he treats where money is coming from. And it pretty much accounts to a kind of FIFA mission statement.
FIFA is an organization of 211 countries. I said it in my speech, I think as well. For us, they are all the same. They are all the same. There wouldn't be anything bad, and there is anything bad, in making sponsorships from Saudi Arabia, from China, from the United States of America, from Brazil, or from India, as far as we are concerned. FIFA is a global organization. Now, I understand when it comes, for example, to Australia, that Australia has trade with Saudi Arabia of, $1.5 billion a year. Between Australia and Saudi Arabia, this doesn't seem to be a problem or an issue between Australian companies and Saudi companies. Between a global organization like FIFA and the Saudi organization like Visit Saudi, this would have been an issue. There is something I don't understand. There is a double standard here which I really don't understand.
There is the nub of a point there, is there not, that the whole world is doing business with Saudi Arabia?
But there's a difference between the realpolitik that states inevitably have to engage in and are unavoidable, for the purpose of world peace, you'd say almost. Even that's a very nebulous concept at the moment, given everything that's going on. And football, which is a sport, which is supposed to be a social good and doesn't have to engage in this realpolitik. And like Infantino there, he talks about all these things as if they're the same. And I know we're in a post-truth world full of culture wars where words don't have meaning anymore, but they're not the same. Accepting money from a Gulf autocracy, and it's specifically, I suppose you'd point to three, given they're also the three that own football clubs, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE. I mean, these are state companies. The influence is unavoidable. You can't detach that. And then you can't detach that from the intentions. And the purpose of it, and this is what sports washing is. People go on about how they think it's, because of the use of the word wash, I would say, they think it's about public relations or image. It's not. It's about something much deeper. It's about integration, normalization, and all for the purposes of sustaining state structure. So, and what's that state structure entail? Well, it's autocracies where the rulers have absolute power that involve a lot of criticism about human rights. Liberal democracies, for all their many flaws, don't involve these questions. I mean, the governments change. It's just not the same thing. By extension, FIFA's relationship with Saudi Arabia is not the same as any liberal democracy's relationship with Saudi Arabia.
Yeah. As you rightly say, there are a host of human rights issues. Let's take one of them, which will be talked about, and it centres around LGBTQ plus rights. Although sexuality isn't a political issue, it's a basic human right. That's obvious. The problem here is religion. And religion is the root of so many problems. And Saudi Arabia is an Islamic state. Its legal system is Sharia law, Islamic law. Its rules are taken from the Quran. No more than the Catholic Church, those views on sexuality don't chime with the modern day world. Where does that leave FIFA? Can FIFA only do business with secular societies? Does football and FIFA ignore the Arab world?
So we saw that there are real echoes of this discussion in the debate last week about rainbow armbands and players who would refuse to wear them. And it is, this discussion, it does ultimately come down to sexuality against religion. And it is one of those, in a global world and a global organization like football, a truly global sport like football, it's one of many points where tensions do arise. It's also one where ultimately, as you point to, a hard decision is required. My stance on this and what I think would be logical thinking for an organization like FIFA, and the decision has to come down to this. What are you in favor for? Inclusiveness or exclusiveness? If a state criminalizes homosexuality, the World Cup is explicitly and directly excluding some of its fan base. You have to take a decision on that. What side do you land on? And it is unfortunate that, by extension, that would mean excluding a lot of countries. But it does come down to the mission of the sport and bigger questions within those countries. And look, it shouldn't be ruled out as well, or it shouldn't be forgotten either. The 2024 tournament in Saudi Arabia is only happening because of how the 2030 tournament has been arranged. Now, same-sex sexual activity is also illegal in Morocco. That's going to be a discussion there, but obviously it's a discussion that's multiplied in Saudi Arabia. And I suppose the issue is more, absolutely, the World Cup. It was really overdue by 2022 that the World Cup should have been in the Muslim world. It should have been in the Arabic world. And, from speaking to people within the game, it is one of those situations where certain accommodations can be made. But ultimately, it does come down to, I spoke to a lot of LGBTQ plus fan groups in the build-up to Qatar, and they said they were comfortable going to Russia. They weren't comfortable going to Qatar. And that is a pretty key point. And that is something that FIFA should be listening to, given their own missions. To me, one of the issues with all of these debates is how they're very quickly drawn into culture war. And it's increasingly a culture war. And this is like Infantino's speech is really a key moment in this, the one on the eve of the Qatar World Cup, where that was basically, he really threw himself into this willingness to divide all debate between the West and the global South. And he was speaking to the global South, which is his new support base. But to me, all this is noise. Discussions about Qatar or Saudi Arabia and all of this, you can bring it down to two issues. One, is the World Cup going to perpetuate human suffering? With the kafala system, yes. Is it going to exclude people? With laws on homosexuality, yes. These are two basic moral issues. I mean, really, the rest is sort of, in some ways, irrelevant, really.
We've seen some serious manoeuvring here to clear the pathway for Saudi Arabia to host the 2034 World Cup. In the process, there's a kind of a sense that Infantino is just running the show, that one man is almost just controlling the destiny of the global game and things like the World Cup. It doesn't feel like this is an organisation that has many checks and balances, that is accountable to the media or accountable to anyone or anything. It's this weird kind of fiefdom, but obviously it controls something that's just so massive. And that level of power is just unhealthy for any one person to have.
Well, it's incredible. I mean, before you even get into kind of nuts and bolts of checks and balances, like think about what we're talking about here, as you've alluded to there. Like from speaking to people in football, they talk about how confederations like FIFA and UEFA in particular, they see themselves as something like a kind of a super world government or the Vatican. And even on basic levels, this involves, Chefrin and Infantino. And one of the issues here is that it could be anyone, because like if you consider what I'm about to say now, what this does to people, they get to fly around the world in private jets, meeting the most powerful people in the world, and essentially bestowing the power of football on these states. And equally then it means basically these two essentially random men. We're not talking even about, say, and I only say Gordon Brown because people have raised him as a potential president, like a Gordon Brown figure with serious political heft and clout and experience. We're talking about just football administrators thrown into this role where, I mean, in Infantino's case, the power of the World Cup is still through him. In Chefrin's case, it's the Champions League. And that comes from these structures where they are basically executive presidents. It's not like they oversee a system of, a two-party system where there's potential resistance. There's so few checks and balances. In fact, due to the bestowing of tournaments and what that means for individual federations, due to all of FIFA and UEFA's committee systems where essentially a lot of heads of member associations or football officials get to live quite lucrative lifestyles. That's pretty key in this due to the structures. Well, why are they going to dissent? It's just a mechanism for returning this to power. And as we say, there's absolutely because they're these kind of international bodies, it's very difficult for any sort of resistance, anyone to question this. It's absolutely incredible because the system, by its nature, becomes self-perpetuating. I do wonder, because of developments like this and because of there's so much going on in football, I think resistance is beginning to grow.
Okay.
But as I discuss in the book, as people in football say to me, change can only come from outside. And that's where it's quite interesting, where there are people in the EU looking at this. A lot of European states are monitoring what's going to happen with England's independent football regulator, because I think a lot of major states, if this is successful, they'll take on similar models. And if that spreads, that is a threat to both FIFA and UEFA. And at the same time, as we spoke about all these legal cases, there is suddenly a bedrock of legal precedent now that will allow challenges to both FIFA and UEFA. And I think these 10 years are going to be a very interesting period of football where we could see real fracturing of the sport in the way we've seen in other sports. And that would be actually a great tragedy that football has come to this, because I think one of its great virtues is its global pyramid.
Okay. But in effect, FIFA has pushed the line so much here. That's
and UEFA. But
UEFA, that actually somehow, some way, there's going to have to be a hang on, this can't continue.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Miguel's very compelling points about sexuality being a line in the sand issue will resonate with many. Others may at least appreciate it is difficult for a global football organisation to simply ignore the Arab world. Regardless of the LGBTQ plus concerns, there are other issues with the Saudi Arabian bid which are not complicated in the least. For instance, millions of people are concerned when it comes to migrant work. 42% of the Saudi population is made up of migrant workers. And this is ironically the area where FIFA have the most responsibility, the most culpability, the most real and tangible effect. There is a lot of building to be done. Saudi World Cup 2034 has to deliver 11 football stadiums and 185,000 hotel rooms in the next 10 years. Last month, ITV aired Kingdom Uncovered inside Saudi Arabia. Some of the footage is absolutely chilling. And when it comes to migrant workers, that old Stalin line jumps to mind. One death is a tragedy, a million a statistic. It is hard for us to compute the suffering. So let's just go with one. The documentary told us about Raju. He's a young man from Nepal. We see a picture of him holding a toddler. Loving family. Like millions of others, Raju decides to go to Saudi Arabia to work. 5 months in, Raju falls ill. He says he has a pain in his kidneys. He tells his camp boss. The boss accuses Raju of faking illness. He's forced to keep working. Things get so bad, his work friends move him around in a wheelbarrow. Raju begs to be let go home to recuperate. In the end, he's told he can return home, but he'd have to pay a fine. The fine amounted to 5 months of his wages. He could not afford that. In the documentary, his family play a voice note that Raju sent them at home in Nepal. In it, he's saying, "I'm very sick. Please rescue me from here. You have to rescue me." The documentary has video footage taken by Raju's friends on their phones of him lying dead in his room. On the footage initially, the camp doctor tells his friends that Raju has just fainted. They angrily tell the doctor Raju hasn't fainted, he's dead. Raju was then carried from his room outside. His friends are livid. They're shouting, "Why are you taking him to hospital? He's dead. You didn't take him when he was alive. Why are you taking him now?" 3 weeks later, we see Raju's body land home in Nepal. There is footage of his father waiting for his body at the airport. He's talking to somebody on the phone as he waits. He says, "I'm heartbroken. I'm standing exactly where we said goodbye." Later, Raju's brother says, if they had just sent him home, we could have helped him. or even if he had to die, he could have died in our arms. At the airport, they load his coffin for home. The Saudis report Raju's death as unknown reason. They include sudden cardiac arrest or respiratory arrest, which is a vague catch-all term. Raju had been feeling unwell for 2 months before his death. In a statement to the documentary, the authorities said, "We are assessing the claims made in this programme, and where required, we'll take appropriate action." It's worth remembering, this is a rich country. They gave Phil Mickelson a reported $200 million to play golf. In the same ITV documentary, which aired earlier this year, they estimate that in the last 8 years, as part of Saudi's Vision 2030, from just Nepal, India and Bangladesh, those 3 countries, 21,000 migrant workers have died since 2016. 21,000 in 8 years. And it's harder to track how many from African countries have also died. How many will die in the rush to get the Saudi Arabian World Cup ready for FIFA? As Gianni Infantino preaches values, how can FIFA award a World Cup to a country where these things are happening? We spoke to the producer and director of the documentary, Sam Collins. I put it to him that the footage around Raju's death is heartbreaking.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we set out to make the film, one of the things that we really wanted to do was show the reality on the ground of the human rights abuses that are happening in Saudi Arabia. And we spoke to experts who said, cases like Raju's aren't just one-off examples. These sorts of experiences for workers, human rights abuses of workers in Saudi Arabia, are endemic. They're happening up and down the country. Raju's case is obviously a particularly egregious one, but we really wanted to set out to show on camera the reality of what was happening. And there's been a huge amount of work done by rights organisations about the nature of the conditions faced by labourers in Saudi Arabia. But I think what is done less often is kind of documenting those abuses on camera. And so when we thought about what we wanted to do and why we wanted to make the programme, it was all about really kind of taking some of those statistics and taking some of those stories kind of off the page and onto the screen, and that was our ambition, really.
An aspect we should mention, by the way, is that making a documentary in Saudi Arabia is not a typical experience.
No. One of the biggest challenges we faced, I think, in making the programme was that free speech is criminalised. And so that presents problems and challenges from a production perspective, because how do we work in that country safely, given that we know that people, critics of the regime and Mohammed bin Salman in particular, are locked up for decades? And then also, how do we reassure the people that we're talking to that we're able to tell their stories safely? And so a huge amount of work went into thinking about safety and security, the security of communications, and reassuring the contributors that we spoke to that the way in which their stories would feature in the program would be in a way that would keep them safe. And they were incredibly brave, the contributors that we spoke to, but it took weeks and weeks of reassuring them of our safety protocols for them to agree to speak to us. And but they really wanted to speak, because these are individuals who are facing extreme challenges and have no ability really to talk about those challenges in a way that will bring about any change, just because of the nature of the regime. We spoke to people who had been imprisoned for complaining about their circumstances on Twitter, and so they were grateful for an opportunity to explain what their situation was in terms of their working conditions, but they wanted to be reassured that they could do that safely. So that was a real challenge.
Where that really hit home as well, watching the documentary, centred around detention centres for me, because in the litany of accusations against Saudi Arabia, detention centres might get a mention without really landing with people, me included. People can be held indefinitely if they're awaiting trial or if there is a problem with their immigration situation or any number of reasons. These detention centres are hell on earth. The footage is shocking. No air, no sunlight, overrun sanitary conditions, filthy, cramped. Testimony included in your documentary of somebody saying suicide attempts are regular, and friends have to tie other friends down to stop suicides happening. The footage is just jaw-dropping. It's just awful.
Yeah, I remember when I first kind of read about those conditions, because they were kind of first reported on 4 years ago. The sort of discrepancy between what we were seeing in terms of Saudi state media talking about the way in which the country had reformed, looking at these huge mega projects that we all know about, like NEOM and plans for World Cup stadiums. The discrepancy between that and the reports that we'd heard and some of the footage from 4 years ago inside the detention centres was, for me, jaw-dropping. I couldn't really reconcile the state media narrative in the videos that we saw with the reality of what I saw in some of the footage that had leaked out of those detention centres. Now, after that initial Telegraph investigation 4 years ago, the Saudi Arabian authorities said that if there was a problem, they would fix it. And so we were keen to find out whether or not that had in fact been the case and whether or not it was fixed. First we spoke to human rights groups that said that they spoke to people inside the detention centres and their understanding was that it was still ongoing. And so at that point we started speaking with a specialist producer who joined our team, who had access to some of the communities inside Saudi Arabia who were affected by these detention centres, and she in turn was able to work with people who had contacts inside the centres, and we were able to get new footage out, which hasn't been done for a long time, purely because last time it was a big story. The authorities went inside the centres and made sure that anybody that had a phone had it confiscated. And, there were reports that people with phones were beaten. So phones inside those centres now are few and far between. But the member of the production team that we worked with was able to find some people who still had phones inside and were keen to take the risk to send footage out. And, they did so because they wanted to be heard. The situation, as you say, inside those centres is desperate. And, some of them think that their only hope really is to get footage out to show what conditions are really like. And so, for the production team, that was a really important part of the film, just because of that huge discrepancy between those conditions that we found inside those centres, still ongoing today, and in the context of the World Cup being awarded to that country today, I think.
What other human rights abuses should we be aware of in light of World Cup going to Saudi Arabia officially today?
Yeah, I mean the biggest one I think is absolutely, or one of the biggest ones absolutely, is the number of workers who are going to be required to work in those conditions. Now, look, our reporter found illegal conditions, that breach Saudi law at NEOM, which is the primary project in NBS's Vision 2030. So if it's happening there, it can be happening anywhere. And we also found, our reporter also found evidence of people who had their passports confiscated. They weren't allowed home to see their wives, their wives or their children when they were getting married, or when a parent passed away. So there are huge challenges, I think, for workers in the country.
We have heard, and we're going to hear a lot of this, I think, over the next decade, that Saudi Arabia, on a whole host of fronts, is the future. It's moving in the right direction. It is making reforms. There is a Western bias against Saudi Arabia. There is exaggeration at play. You have seen a huge amount of footage. You don't make a documentary like this without seeing hours of footage and thinking about these things very deeply. What's your response to that sense that there is exaggeration, that Saudi Arabia is moving in the right direction?
Yeah, I think what's important here is that huge discrepancy between what we're being told and what's being documented, not just in our film, but also by other organisations, people, activists, rights organisations. The discrepancy between what we're being told and what is actually happening is vast, and we're at a point, I think, where organisations can have impeccable human rights policies. If you look at the human rights policy of NEOM or the human rights policy of FIFA, they're brilliantly written documents where you wouldn't bat an eyelid. That's the right approach. But what's actually happening doesn't match up with those approaches set out in those policies, and so you get to this really odd situation where one thing is being said and something else is what's happening on the ground, and those two things just don't marry up. And even with kind of the UK Prime Minister travelling to Saudi Arabia just yesterday, and the meetings he had with NBS, the clear suggestion, I think, from some of the press conferences that came out afterwards was that human rights isn't as important as kind of the economic benefits that Saudi Arabia might bring to the UK. And look, there is of course, there's a real politic that goes on and must go on, but I think we have to be clear-eyed about the extent to which these abuses are happening, and we can't pretend that they're not happening, and we have to engage with them. And I think one other thing that I would say about this is there have been so many questions, including questions that we raised in our documentary, aimed at FIFA, and they just pointed us to their own policies and documents around human rights. But other organisations have asked specific and detailed questions based on their research. And FIFA's response has been not to respond at all, not to engage. I don't think Infantino has given a press conference for a year. And so I think we have to engage with these issues. They can't be ignored. But at the moment, it seems that they're playing second fiddle.
So what's your feeling today as Saudi Arabia is given the 2034 World Cup?
I just think that it's incredibly important that we and football fans and everybody connected that loves the game thinks very carefully about what this means, having a World Cup in Saudi Arabia. What do we need to do to get FIFA to engage with concerns around human rights? Because at the moment it seems that they're not engaging, and your hope would be that over the next 10 years, that engagement starts to happen. What has been learned from the World Cup in Qatar, it would appear not very much. And what ultimately will that mean for sports fans going forward? They stomached the Qatar World Cup. Will they stomach another World Cup? What is happening to the game?
We can only really scratch the surface here. These are complicated issues, complicated countries. People will mention 172 killed by the death penalty in 2023 in Saudi Arabia. Some of their families reportedly not even told where their loved ones are buried. And you may well point to the USA, which killed 24 people by death penalty that same year. And no country is perfect. But then the Saudi judicial system is beyond flawed. For instance, Human Rights Watch detail confessions secured by torture. We haven't touched on women's rights. Or even, in just more basic terms, the fact that it's 2024 and we're talking about an autocracy. If you want the very short version of this story, there are 2 dates to remember. In 1938, Saudi Arabia discovered oil. In 2014, the PIF was given permission to make foreign investments. And the last decade has simply demonstrated an obvious point. The world and everything in it is for sale. And it feels like football and FIFA have been bought very willingly. Money taken, criticisms be damned. And we are talking about the most popular sport in the world here. Money should not be the issue. Like Qatar, the 2034 World Cup will be bloodstained. But of course, FIFA would and do dispute that. We'll give final word to Gianni Infantino, speaking today in Zurich.
Dear friends, the essence of football is its unpredictability. And its strength is our unity. Dear friends, we live unity. We live inclusivity. And we live football. So let's make history together. Let's unite the world with football and through football.